The sound was what stopped him first. Not the crash of the clay pot shattering against the stone corridor floor. Not the scatter of dried herbs across the cold flagstones, or the clatter of the wooden tray spinning and rolling until it stilled against the wall. It was the silence that came after. A silence too careful, too practiced, the kind that only a person who had learned to make themselves invisible could produce so quickly. King Leander of Varenhold paused at the far end of the corridor, one gauntleted hand resting against the stone arch. He had been returning from the War Council chamber, still carrying the weight of the morning's reports, a border skirmish near the Ashfen Ridge, grain stores running thin in the eastern villages, a messenger from the southern lords whose tone had been just barely too familiar. His mind had been full of iron and strategy, the kind of tiredness that lived behind the eyes and never quite left. And then the sound. He stood still and watched. His son, Prince Edric, 14 years old, broad for his age, wearing the gold-trimmed burgundy tunic that the castle seamstresses had finished only a fortnight ago, stood in the middle of the corridor with his chin lifted and his jaw set. Before him, crouched low on the floor, was a young woman gathering broken shards and scattered sprigs of dried lavender with trembling hands. She was not young in the way noble women were young, preserved by comfort and idleness. She was young the way a birch tree battered by too many winters is still young, the bones of her youth still visible beneath the weariness. Her linen dress was the dull color of unbleached wool. Her gray cloak had a small tear near the left shoulder. Her long blonde hair had been braided down her back, but several strands had come loose and fell across her face as she bent over the mess on the floor. She did not push them aside. She did not look up. Edric's boot, fine leather, dark brown, recently polished by some other servant whose name he likely did not know, nudged one of the larger ceramic shards closer to her knee. It was not accidental. Leander had seen enough battles to know the difference between an accident and a deliberate act dressed as one. "Clumsy wretch," the prince said, his voice carrying the particular satisfaction of someone who has never once been told that satisfaction of that kind is shameful. "That was my grandmother's pot. Do you know what it was worth?" The young woman said nothing. Her hands continued moving, careful, methodical, gathering what could be gathered. A small cut had opened on the side of her right hand from one of the shards. A thin line of blood welled against her pale skin. She did not stop to look at it. "Answer me when I speak to you," Edric said, and his boot moved again, this time against the tray, sending it skidding across the floor and striking her knuckle. She flinched. Just barely. Just enough. Leander moved. He was a large man, the kind of large that had been forged over 20 years of war rather than simply inherited, and when he walked with purpose, even seasoned warriors tended to step aside before they fully understood why. His boots struck the flagstones with a rhythm that was slow and deliberate, and by the time Edric registered the sound and turned, his father was already close enough that looking up at him required a real tilt of the head. "Father." "Step back," Leander said. 2 words, flat as a blade laid on a table. Edric stepped back. Leander crouched down in the space the prince had vacated. The young woman on the floor had gone completely still, the way a rabbit goes still when it senses something larger than the original threat has entered the clearing. Her hands were frozen over the scattered herbs. She had not looked up. She was, he realized, genuinely uncertain whether crouching down beside her was a kindness or the beginning of something worse. That realization settled somewhere behind his sternum and stayed there. He picked up the wooden tray and set it beside her without a word. Then he reached for the larger ceramic shards himself, gathering them in his gauntleted palm so that she would not need to risk her hands further. She watched his hands for a long moment. The dark leather, the metal fastenings at the wrist, the deliberate and unhurried care of the motion. And then she seemed to reach some private decision, because she began moving again, gathering the lavender sprigs one by one and placing them on the tray. "What is your name?" he asked. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, but not weak. There was a difference. "Mabel, Your Majesty. Mabel." He said it the way he read maps, registering the detail, committing it to memory. "How long have you served in the castle?" A brief pause. 3 years, Your Majesty. 3 years. He tried to recall whether he had seen her before. The castle held over 200 servants, and he had never been a king who managed his household the way some men managed a battlefield, with obsessive attention to every moving piece. He had trusted his head steward, Lord Brennan, to see to it. He wondered suddenly whether that trust had been fully deserved. "You are bleeding," he said. Her right hand curled slightly, instinctively, as though she wished to hide it. "It is nothing, Your Majesty. It is a cut that wants cleaning." He rose, and the full height of him filled the corridor again. He turned to look at his son. Edric had the sense to look uncertain. He was not, at heart, a cruel boy. Leander knew this, had watched him carefully for years, had seen him laugh freely with the stable hands and share his bread with the hunting hounds without a second thought. But he was a prince, and no one in this castle had ever made him feel the weight of what that meant in the presence of those who had no power to refuse him. That, Leander understood with a clarity that was almost painful, was a failure of instruction. And the failure belonged to him. "The pot," Leander said quietly, "was not your grandmother's. It came from the kitchens. I know this because I watched a servant carry it up from the lower stores this morning when I passed through the courtyard." He let that land. "What I watched just now, I will not watch again. Are we clear?" Edric's jaw worked. His eyes cut briefly to Mabel, still kneeling on the floor, and then back to his father. Something shifted in his face. Not shame. Not yet. But the first uncomfortable awareness that shame was the correct response. "Yes, Father. You will go to Brennan and tell him you require a task, a physical one, in the kitchens or the stables, his choosing, not yours. You will work it without complaint. Today." The prince's mouth opened, closed. "I understand." "Good, go." Edric went. His footsteps retreated down the corridor, faster than they needed to be, and the sound of them faded into the cold stone distance until only the low moan of wind through the high window remained. Leander looked back down at Mabel. She had finished gathering what could be gathered. The tray sat in her hands, a small mound of ceramic fragments and crushed lavender arranged with a neatness that seemed almost reflexive, as though even in the aftermath of being humiliated, she could not quite stop herself from trying to create order. She was looking at him now, just barely, just enough to be respectful without quite meeting his eyes. "Can you walk to the healing ward?" he asked. "Yes, Your Majesty." He nodded once. Then, because he was not entirely certain what else to do with the strange feeling sitting in his chest, something between guilt and resolve, old and uncomfortable, he reached into the leather satchel at his belt and removed the small square of linen he kept there for field dressings. He had carried one since his first campaign. Old habit. He held it out to her. She looked at it for a moment, that stretched just a little too long enough for him to understand that people in her position were not often handed things by people in his. Then she took it, carefully, and pressed it against the cut on her hand. "Thank you, Your Majesty," she said. He said nothing more. He straightened, turned, and walked back the way he had come. But before he rounded the corner, he glanced back once, just once, and saw her still kneeling there, the gray cloak pooled around her on the cold stone floor, the linen cloth pressed to her hand. Watching the place where he had been standing as though trying to understand what had just happened, he was asking himself the same question. Word count: 5 e 12. Deixe-me terminar com a cena de abertura e extensão adequada antes de fechar o bloco. The healing ward was on the eastern side of the castle, past the armory and the old chapel whose stones always smelled of pine resin and cold iron. Mabel knew the way. She had carried poultices there twice for other servants, though she had never gone for herself. Omegas who reported injuries were occasionally seen as problems, rather than people deserving of care, and she had learned early that it was simpler to bind her own hurts with scraps of cloth and continue working. But the king had told her to go. And that, she had learned, was a category of instruction entirely different from everything else. She walked quietly through the corridor, the tray balanced in her uninjured hand, the linen pressed against her right palm. The lavender's crushed scent rose faintly around her as she moved, soft and incongruously peaceful, the smell of something that had been whole not very long ago. She could not stop thinking about his eyes. Not the color, though they were startling. A pale ice blue that seemed to collect light rather than reflect it. It was the way they had looked at her. Direct, clear, without the particular blankness that most eyes in this castle held when they passed over a servant, that practiced unseeing, that polite erasure. He had looked at her as though she was a person. She pressed the linen tighter against her palm and told herself firmly that this was not something to think about. She told herself that twice more before she reached the healing ward's heavy oak door, and she was not certain she believed it either time. The healing ward smelled of beeswax candles, dried chamomile, and something sharper beneath it all, the astringent bite of willow bark tincture that the castle's head healer, Sister Rowan, brewed in large clay pots and kept stoppered with wax-sealed corks along the far shelf. The room was modest but well-ordered, the kind of space that reflected the personality of the woman who ran it. Every bundle of herbs hung in precise rows from the low rafters, every linen bandage rolled and stacked with the same quiet insistence on dignity that Sister Rowan applied to everything she touched. She was a beta woman of perhaps 50 years, with silver-streaked brown hair pinned beneath a plain linen coif, and hands that moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who had seen enough suffering to stop being frightened by it. When Mabel pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped inside, Sister Rowan looked up from the mortar where she was grinding something that smelled of cloves and earth, and her sharp gray eyes went immediately to the linen cloth pressed against Mabel's palm. "Sit," she said, in the tone she used for everyone regardless of rank, the tone that made even the castle's beta commanders obey without thinking. Mabel sat on the low wooden stool beside the work table. She set the tray with its broken fragments carefully on the floor beside her feet, unwilling to place a mess on Sister Rowan's clean surfaces. The healer crossed the room, took Mabel's hand without ceremony, and peeled back the linen. The cut was not deep, a clean line across the heel of the palm, already beginning to close. But it was long enough to need care. Sister Rowan made a small sound that conveyed neither alarm nor indifference, then reached for a cloth and the willow bark tincture. "Ceramic?" she asked. "Yes, sister." "Dropped something or had something dropped near you?" Mabel was quiet for a moment. "The first," she said. It was not entirely a lie. The pot had not been in her hands when it fell. Sister Rowan looked at her. The healer had a way of looking at people that was similar to reading a manuscript. Patient, thorough, willing to sit with difficult passages. She did not press. She cleaned the cut with the tincture, a brief, bright sting, and then began wrapping it with a clean strip of linen, her fingers moving in the practiced loops and crosses of someone who had bound thousands of such wounds. "You came alone," Sister Rowan observed. "Yes. No one sent you?" A pause that was perhaps a half-breath too long. "His Majesty suggested I come." The healer's hands stilled for just a moment. Then they resumed their work. "Did he?" It was not a question. Mabel looked at the floor. Sister Rowan tied off the bandage and released Mabel's hand with a gentleness that was almost maternal, the kind that asked nothing in return, which was precisely why it was so difficult to receive. "How is the rest of you?" she asked, in the same tone she might use to ask about the weather. "Well, sister, truly." The healer turned back to her work table and resumed grinding. "Leave the tray. I'll see to the fragments. You can return for it before the evening meal." Mabel rose, smoothing her cloak with her uninjured hand. "Thank you, Sister Rowan." "Mabel." The healer did not look up, but her voice shifted slightly. "Just enough. If something is happening in this castle that ought not be happening, my door is open, day or evening. You understand me?" Mabel stood still for a moment. Outside, wind moved against the high window, rattling the old iron latch in its frame. The candles on the shelf swayed together like a small, uncertain congregation. "I understand," she said, and she left. The corridor outside the healing ward was empty, which was a relief. Mabel walked slowly, keeping close to the wall as she had been taught. A servant's path, unobtrusive and skirting the centers of rooms and passages where important people moved. She had learned this the way she had learned most things in this castle. Through observation, repetition, and the quiet accumulation of small corrections that were never quite delivered kindly. She had come to Varenhold 3 years ago, in the late autumn of her 22nd year, when the village of Ashfin, a small, gray place at the kingdom's eastern edge, had nothing left to offer its Omega daughters but hunger, and the particular brand of shame that poor communities reserve for those who cannot contribute to their own survival. Her mother had pressed 2 copper coins into her hand, kissed her forehead, and told her the castle always needed servants. Her mother had not been wrong. She had simply left out the part about what it cost to become invisible enough to survive inside those walls. 3 years of rising before dawn to carry water. 3 years of scrubbing stone floors on her knees, while the cold crept up through the grit and settled in her joints. 3 years of learning which corridors to avoid at certain hours, which nobles had tempers that required no provocation, and how to fold herself small enough that the space she occupied never became an inconvenience to anyone. She was good at it by now. She did not take pride in the skill, but she acknowledged it. What she had not learned, what no amount of practice had prepared her for, was what to do when the King of Varenhold crouched beside her on the floor and handed her a piece of linen as though it were the most natural thing in the world. She turned the memory over as she walked, cautious with it, the way one is cautious with something found in the road whose nature is not yet clear. She could not afford to make it into something it was not. She was an Omega servant. He was an Alpha King. The distance between those 2 points was not measured in steps, but in something far more fundamental, in bloodline and rank, and the ancient hierarchies that shaped every life in Varenhold as surely as the stone walls shaped the castle around her. He had been decent to her. That was all. She would remember it as decency and nothing more. She nearly walked directly into the man standing at the far end of the corridor. Lord Brennan, the castle's head steward, was a lean beta of middle years, with a pointed gray beard and the eyes of someone who catalogued everything he observed and filed it away in some internal ledger for future use. He wore his steward's chain, the linked iron rings of his office, over a dark wool doublet, and he held a rolled parchment in one hand, which he tapped against his opposite palm with a metronomic patience. He looked at Mabel, then at the bandage on her hand, then back at her face, with an expression that revealed nothing. "The prince came to me this morning," he said, without preamble. "Most unusual errand for a royal heir. He told me his father had sent him." His pale eyes did not blink. "Would you know anything about that?" Mabel kept her voice even. "I would not presume to know His Highness's business, my lord." Brennan studied her for a moment that stretched uncomfortably long. Something moved behind his eyes, calculation or curiosity, or both together, dressed as neither. "You are one of the lower hall maids," he said. "Third corridor, eastern wing." "Yes, my lord." "I don't recall assigning you to the private residential corridor this morning." "I was rerouted by the morning housemistress. The usual path near the kitchens was being resanded." She held his gaze without challenge, without heat, just steadily. She had been asked questions like this before, questions designed not to retrieve information, but to see whether the person being asked would flinch. She did not flinch. Brennan tapped the parchment against his palm twice more. Then he nodded, short and precise. "I see, very well. Return to your duties." He moved past her without another word, his footsteps precise and unhurried, and she listened to them fade around the corner before she allowed herself to exhale. Her hands were perfectly still at her sides. She was careful to keep them that way until she was certain she was alone. Then she pressed her bandaged palm flat against the cold stone wall and stood there for a moment with her eyes closed, feeling the chill seep through the linen and settle against the cut beneath it, something real and grounding and immediate, a sensation that asked nothing of her and offered nothing in return. She thought about Brennan's eyes. She thought about the way he had said, "I don't recall assigning you." Not as a rebuke, but as a marker. A small iron pin pressed into a map. She had been noticed in a way she had not been noticed before, and she was old enough and careful enough to understand that being noticed was not always a gift. Down the corridor, somewhere in the direction of the kitchens, she could hear Prince Edric's voice, younger and less certain than she had ever heard it, asking a cook what needed to be done. She pressed away from the wall, straightened her cloak, and walked back toward the eastern wing. There was water to carry, and floors to attend to, and a long afternoon of work that would not wait. But the king's ice-blue eyes followed her through all of it, steady and uninvited, like a candle burning in a room she had not meant to enter. 3 days passed before Mabel saw the king again. They were 3 days of ordinary cold, the kind that settled into the castle walls in late autumn and refused to be driven out by any number of fires burning in any number of hearths. She carried water. She swept stone. She hauled linens down to the washerwomen near the lower courtyard and hauled them back again, stiff and smelling of lye, and hung them on the iron hooks in the corridor to dry in the thin draft that moved through the castle like a slow, indifferent breath. She did not think about him. She was very deliberate about this. On the 4th morning, she was assigned to the Great Hall. The Great Hall of Varenhold was the castle's largest room, a vast vaulted space with 4 long oak tables running its length, a raised dais at the far end where the king's high table stood, and a fireplace broad enough to stand inside built into the eastern wall. In autumn and winter, the fire was kept burning from before dawn until well past the evening meal, and it was Mabel's task on those mornings to carry fresh wood from the stores near the side door, stack it beside the hearth, and sweep the ash from the previous evening out and away before the hall was opened for the day. She was on her 3rd trip with the wood when she heard footsteps on the dais stairs. She did not look up. She set the logs carefully beside the iron grate, arranged them with the same quiet efficiency she brought to every task, and reached for the long-handled ash broom, leaning against the stone. "You changed the bandage." She turned then. She could not quite help it. King Leander stood at the base of the dais stairs, still wearing his night-dark training leathers, the heavy kind, creased and worn at the elbows and knees, that spoke of a morning already spent in the yard, rather than the council chamber. His dark braids were pulled back and tied with a strip of leather. There was a faint shine of exertion along his jaw, and the small scar at the left corner of his mouth, which she had not let herself look at directly before, caught the firelight as he turned toward her. He was looking at her hand. The bandage was clean now, her own work from the previous evening. A shorter strip wound more tightly, the way she had learned to do it when Sister Rowan's supplies were not available. "Yes, Your Majesty," she said. Sister Rowan did not redress it, she offered. "I did not wish to take more of her time." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a frown. More like the slight adjustment a man makes when he has heard something that does not fit the shape of what he expected. He walked toward the fire, not toward her, she noted, but toward the warmth, which brought him nevertheless into the same general territory, and stood with his hands clasped behind his back, looking into the flames. "How is it healing?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, genuinely uncertain whether this was a question she was meant to answer fully or simply acknowledge. "Well, Your Majesty, it was not deep." He nodded once. The fire crackled and spit a small ember onto the hearthstone, where it dimmed and died. Outside the narrow windows, the sky was the pale gray of early morning, the color of wool left in rain. "I owe you something of an explanation," he said. Mabel's hands tightened slightly on the broom handle. "Your Majesty owes me nothing." "Perhaps not by law." He turned from the fire then, and looked at her with those pale eyes that collected light rather than reflected it. "But I watched my son treat you with contempt, and I have been thinking about that these 3 days. Not about what he did. That has been addressed. But about how long it may have been happening, and how many others may have treated you similarly, and whether anyone in this castle with the authority to prevent it has ever troubled to look." The words arrived slowly, each one distinct, the way stones are set in a wall, with intention, with weight. Mabel did not know what to do with them. In 3 years, no person in a position above her had ever suggested that what happened to her might be something worth troubling over. She said carefully, "The castle is well run, Your Majesty." "That is a very diplomatic answer." "I am a servant, Your Majesty. Diplomacy is a form of survival." She had not meant to say that. It came out before she could catch it. Too honest, too sharp-edged, the kind of thing she usually pressed down before it reached her mouth. She felt the familiar cold tightening in her chest, the preparation for consequence. But Leander did not look offended. He looked, if anything, as though she had said something he had needed to hear. "Yes," he said quietly. "I imagine it is." A silence settled between them. It was not a comfortable silence, but it was not hostile either. It was the silence of two people occupying the same space and finding that the space is, perhaps, less impossible than expected. Mabel returned to sweeping. It was the only reasonable thing to do. The ash moved in small gray clouds before the broom, and she worked her way methodically across the hearthstone, collecting the debris of the previous night's fire into a copper pan. She was aware of him watching her in the same way she was aware of the fire's warmth, not looking at it directly, but feeling it regardless. "Mabel," he said. She paused, looked up. "If something in this castle troubles you, treatment, condition, assignment, you may bring it to Sister Rowan. I have spoken with her. She will see that it reaches me." She stared at him. She could not quite stop herself. "Your Majesty, I'm not asking you to report on others. I am telling you that your account of your own circumstances is worth hearing." He held her gaze without flinching from it. "That is all." He left before she could find an answer, his footsteps crossing the hall with that same deliberate, unhurried rhythm, the leather of his training gear creaking faintly as he climbed the dais stairs and disappeared through the door behind the high table. Mabel stood beside the fireplace with the ash pan in one hand and the broom in the other, and the flames threw her shadow long and wavering across the cold stone floor. She thought, "This is a trap of some kind." She thought, "It is not a trap." She thought, "I do not know how to tell the difference, and that is the most frightening thing." The person who did know, or believed she did, was a woman named Sina. Sina was 34 years old, a beta who had served in Varenhold's kitchen since she was 17, and who had survived that length of service by developing a thorough and largely accurate model of how power moved through the castle, who held it, who borrowed it, who traded in it, and who was crushed beneath it when the arrangements shifted. She was broad-shouldered and dark-haired, with calloused hands and a habit of chewing dried rosemary when she was thinking hard about something. She chewed it now, sitting across from Mabel at the small servants' table in the lower kitchen alcove, where the two of them ate their midday bread when their schedules overlapped. "He spoke to you," Sina said, not a question. She had heard, because Sina always heard. He asked after my hand, Mabel said, tearing her bread, and told me I could bring concerns to Sister Rowan. Sina chewed her rosemary thoughtfully. The kitchen behind them was full of noise, the clang of iron pots, the hiss of something boiling, the low rumble of the head cook directing the afternoon's preparation for the evening meal. Somewhere near the hearth, a younger girl was singing softly to herself, a village tune in a minor key. You know what the other servants are saying, Sina said. I know they are saying something. I don't know what. They are saying the king has taken a personal interest in an Omega Maid, and they are saying it in the tone people use when they mean something that will not end well for the Omega Maid. Mabel was quiet. She ate her bread. I'm not telling you to be frightened, Sina continued. I am telling you to be careful. There is a difference. She paused. Brennan has been asking questions. He spoke to me in the corridor. He spoke to 3 other servants as well. About you. About where you were assigned and why. Sina's dark eyes were direct and entirely without cruelty. She was not frightening Mabel for the pleasure of it. She was doing it because she believed information shared honestly was the only real protection one woman could offer another in a place like this. He is building something. I don't know yet what kind. Mabel folded her hands around her bread and looked at them. The bandage on her right palm was still clean and white against her skin, a small, careful thing in the middle of an ordinary morning. She thought about Brennan's calculating eyes. She thought about the king's steady ones. She thought about Prince Edric in the kitchen that morning, apparently scrubbing a cauldron under the instruction of a cook who had no idea what to do with a prince who showed up asking for work, and seemed, to everyone's bewilderment, to mean it. Sina, she said, do you think the king is a good man? Sina chewed her rosemary for a long moment. Outside, wind struck the kitchen's high window and curled away, carrying with it the distant smell of pine from the forest beyond the castle walls. I think, Sina said at last, that good men in positions of great power are rarer than snowfall in summer. And I think that when one appears, it is wise to observe him very carefully before deciding whether the goodness is real. She stood, brushing crumbs from her apron. It is also wise to remember that even a good king is still a king. She left. The younger girl near the hearth was still singing, her voice thin and sweet as wood smoke. Mabel sat alone with her bread, and the thought that had been sitting at the edge of her mind for 4 days now, quiet and patient as a wolf at the tree line. He looked at me as though I was worth looking at. She pressed it down. She folded it away. She went back to work. The first snow came on a Tuesday. Mabel knew it before she saw it, felt it in the quality of the silence that settled over the castle in the gray hour before dawn, a hush that was different from ordinary quiet, thicker and more deliberate, as though the world outside had drawn a long breath and decided to hold it. She was already awake, already dressed in her linen underdress and wool overdress, and the gray cloak that had been mended twice at the shoulder, pulling on her boots by the thin light of a tallow candle when the first flake drifted past the small window above her pallet. By the time she reached the great hall with her first load of firewood, the courtyard below was white. She stood for a moment at the narrow window at the corridor's end and looked at it, the clean, indifferent beauty of the first snowfall, which covered everything with the same impartial hand. The cobblestones and the refuse heap and the bare-branched oak in the yard's center all rendered equally pale and equally still. There was something she had always found quietly devastating about the first snow. Not sadness, exactly. More like the particular ache of beauty that arrives without asking whether you are ready for it. She turned away and went to build the fire. The King's War Council met that morning in the round chamber off the East Tower, a room Mabel passed twice in her work, each time carrying something in both arms, each time keeping her eyes forward and her pace unhurried. The voices inside were low and controlled, the way men speak when they are discussing things they do not want to travel through stone walls. She caught fragments despite herself. Ashfin Ridge and the southern lords are stalling, and once, very clearly, a voice that was not the king saying something about the Omega territories in a tone she did not like. She kept walking. On her third pass, the door was open. She did not slow down. She did not look in. But in the space of 3 steps, she registered the room's contents with the thoroughness of someone who has learned that information is a form of armor. 6 men around a circular oak table. Maps weighted at the corners with iron ingots, candles burning in iron brackets on the walls. Lord Brennan stood to the king's left, his steward's chain glinting, his pointed gray beard directed at something on the table before him. 2 men she did not recognize, nobles by their wool cloaks and the silver at their belts, sat across from the king with expressions that were carefully composed into something resembling deference, but were not quite that. And the king himself, seated at the table's head, one large hand resting flat on the map before him, his dark braids falling forward over his shoulder as he looked down at whatever was being discussed. He was in his formal leathers today, the black ones with the silver wolf head clasps at the shoulders, and the firelight from the chamber's hearth caught the planes of his face and the faint silver threading through his beard at the jaw. He looked up as she passed. She had been careful not to look in, but she felt his gaze the way one feels a shift in wind, a change in the quality of the air, directional and unmistakable. She did not turn her head. She kept walking. Behind her, one of the voices she did not recognize said something, quietly, that produced a brief silence. She was too far away to hear the words. She was not too far away to hear Brennan's reply, low and deliberate. A servant, no one of consequence. She kept her steps even. She kept her breathing measured. She turned the corner and was gone. No one of consequence. She had been told this her entire life, in 100 different registers, some cruel, some indifferent, some offered as simple fact with no malice intended, which was somehow the hardest kind to carry. She was practiced at receiving it. She knew how to let it move through her without catching, the way water moves through cupped hands. Today, for a reason she could not entirely name, it caught. She was in the linen store off the second corridor, counting folded sheets and marking the count on a small wax tablet with a stick of charred wood, when she heard the boots. She recognized the rhythm before the door opened. She was not certain when she had learned it. Leander filled the doorway the way he filled most spaces, not aggressively, but completely, as though his presence had a physical weight that rearranged the air around it. He was still in his formal leathers. He looked at her for a moment before speaking. "You passed the council chamber," he said. "I was carrying linens, Your Majesty. It was my assigned corridor." "I know." He stepped inside, just far enough that he was no longer standing in the doorway. And the linen store, which was not a large room, became considerably smaller. Brennan said something as you passed. She kept her eyes on the wax tablet. "I did not hear it, Your Majesty." A pause. "Mabel." She looked up. His expression was not angry. It was something more careful than anger. The look of a man who has identified a problem and is thinking precisely about how to address it. "You heard it," he said. Not an accusation. A simple reading. She held his gaze for one honest moment. "Yes, Your Majesty. It was wrong." The words were direct and unadorned. "What Brennan said was wrong, and had I caught it in the moment, I would have addressed it in the moment. I am addressing it now." Mabel set down the wax tablet. She was aware that her heart was doing something irregular, something she did not particularly want it to do, and she focused on keeping her face still and her voice even. "My Lord Brennan said what most people in this castle believe," she said quietly. "I hold no grievance against him for speaking a common truth. It is not a truth. Your Majesty, it is not a truth," he repeated, and the quiet authority in it was not a command, but something heavier, a conviction, the kind that had been tested and had not broken. "You are a person of consequence, every person in this castle is a person of consequence. That some of them have been taught otherwise, and that I have permitted that teaching to continue by absence of correction. That is a failure I intend to remedy. The linen store was very quiet. Outside, snow was still falling. She could feel the cold coming off the outer wall to her left, seeping through the stone, and the single candle on the shelf threw both their shadows long against the folded white sheets stacked behind her. She said, very carefully, "Why are you telling me this?" He was quiet for a moment. It was the first time she had seen him hesitate. "Because you are the person I should have told first," he said. "And because I think you have been waiting a long time for someone to say it, and have stopped expecting that anyone will." Something happened in Mabel's chest then, a loosening, small and sudden, like a knot that has been pulled tight for so long that the fibers have begun to forget what loose felt like. She pressed her lips together. She looked at the candle flame instead of his face. "You are making things difficult, Your Majesty," she said, and her voice was very nearly steady. "I know." And to her complete astonishment, something in his expression shifted, brief and quiet, a shadow of something that was almost a smile. "I seem to do that." He left. The door swung shut behind him, and she stood alone in the small room with the cold and the candlelight and the neat stacked white of the linens on every side, and she pressed both hands flat against the nearest shelf and breathed through the feeling that was rising in her chest, slow and inexorable as the tide. She was not foolish. She was not a girl who dreamed past her station. She had been surviving too long and too deliberately to mistake a king's decency for something it was not, to let warmth trick her into forgetting the distance between them. But he had come to a linen store to tell her she mattered. She stayed very still for a long moment. Then she picked up the wax tablet and the charred stick, and she finished counting the sheets. And she did not let herself think about ice blue eyes or the shadow of a smile, or the way he had said, "You are the person I should have told first," as though the order of things had been wrong and he intended to correct it. She did not think about any of it. She was very, very unsuccessful. That evening, she found something on the small wooden stool outside the servants' dormitory door where she slept. It was a cloak. Heavy wool, deep charcoal gray. Not the rough weave of a servant's cloth, but something finer, with a proper hood and a clasp of worked iron in the shape of a small wolf's head. Folded beneath it was a pair of wool-lined gloves. There was no note. There did not need to be. Sina appeared at her shoulder from the corridor behind her, looked at the cloak, looked at Mabel, and said nothing for a very long moment. "Be careful," she said finally, her voice low and without judgment. Just the shape of the words, worn smooth with genuine concern. Mabel touched the clasp. The iron was cold beneath her fingers, finely made, the wolf's features rendered with a craftsman's care. She thought about what it meant, and what it cost to receive it, and all the ways it could become dangerous. Then she picked up the cloak and held it against the cold. Outside, snow fell on Varenhold without pause or mercy, covering everything equally, the high towers and the refuse heap, the king's chambers and the servants' corridor, all of it white and still and waiting for what morning would bring. Lord Brennan moved like water finding cracks in stone, quietly, persistently, without announcing the direction of his pressure until the damage was already done. Mabel understood this about him by the second week of snow, when she began noticing the small rearrangements in her daily assignments. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that could be pointed to and named as deliberate. But the corridors she was sent to clean shifted gradually, away from the Great Hall, away from the East Tower, away from the routes that the king walked in his morning rounds. She was reassigned to the lower kitchens for 3 days, then to the outer laundry near the western wall where the wind came off the open hillside and turned the water in the washing basins to ice at the edges before noon. She said nothing. She worked. She kept the new cloak folded inside her pallet during the day and wore it only in the early morning hours when the corridors were empty, when the cold was at its worst, and no one was awake to observe it. She was practical. She had always been practical. But Sina noticed the reassignments, because Sina noticed everything, and on the 6th morning of the outer laundry duty, she appeared at the washing basin beside Mabel, with a bundle of kitchen cloths that did not need washing, and her jaw set in the particular way it set when she had made a decision. Brennan spoke to the house mistress, Sina said, plunging the cloths into the basin without ceremony. I heard it from the girl who sweeps the steward's corridor. He told her you were becoming distracted from your duties and needed more structured work. Mabel wrung out a sheet. Her hands were red from the cold water, the bandage long since removed, the cut fully healed, but the skin still tender where it had knit together. Distracted, she repeated. That was the word he used. They worked in silence for a moment. The hillside beyond the castle wall was white and empty, under a sky the color of pewter, and the wind moved through the gap in the stones with a thin, persistent moan. He is watching to see what I do, Mabel said. He is watching to see what the king does, Sina corrected. You are the instrument of measurement. If the king adjusts your assignment again, Brennan learns something about how far the king's interest extends. If the king does nothing, Brennan learns something else. What does he want to learn? Sina was quiet for a moment, her dark hands moving steadily through the water. Brennan has served 3 kings, she said at last. He survived each transition by understanding where power was truly held and aligning himself precisely to it. He is not a cruel man. He is a careful one, and careful men who have held power for a long time become very uncomfortable when they encounter variables they did not plan for. I am a variable, Mabel said. The word felt strange in her mouth, small and cold as the water. You are a variable he did not plan for, Sina said, which was different. She saw the king on a Thursday, 9 days into the outer laundry rotation, entirely by accident. She had been sent to deliver a message to the head cook, a wax-sealed note from the house mistress regarding the evening meal's requirements, and the fastest route from the laundry to the kitchens cut through the lower courtyard, across the stone path that ran beside the training yard. She took it without thinking, her hood up against the wind, her breath fogging before her face, the sealed note tucked inside her cloak. The training yard was not empty. The king was working with a practice sword, a long weighted thing of dark wood, against a beta warrior named Maid, who served as the king's personal sparring partner. Maid was a formidable man, nearly as large as Leander, with close cropped red hair and the kind of face that looked like it had been broken and reset more than once. He pressed hard, and the king met him without retreating, the 2 of them moving through the snow-dusted yard with the focused intensity of men who had trained together long enough to know precisely where the edges of each other's capabilities were. Mabel walked along the path. She kept her head forward. She kept her pace even. She was nearly past when Leander said, without looking away from Maid, "The outer laundry." She stopped. She could not entirely help it. He blocked a strike from Maid, turned it, stepped away. You have been assigned to the outer laundry for 9 days. She stood on the path with the cold wind pulling at her hood and said carefully, Yes, Your Majesty. He lowered the practice sword. Maid stepped back, breathing hard, and had the discretion to find something absorbing to look at on the far side of the yard. Leander turned to face her. Snow had collected in his dark braids and along the shoulders of his training leathers. There was color in his face from the exertion and the cold, and he looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize. That particular quality of attention that felt, impossibly, like being the only thing in the field of view. That assignment was not made by me, he said. I know, Your Majesty. Does it trouble you? She thought about the ice at the edges of the washing basins. She thought about her hands. She thought about Sina's words. You are the instrument of measurement. and about what answer would serve her best in this moment. And then, because she was tired and cold and had been practicing honesty with this particular man for 2 weeks now in small, dangerous increments, she said the true thing. "The cold is difficult," she said. "I manage it." Something tightened around his eyes. Not anger directed at her. The other kind, the kind directed inward or at a situation, the look of a man recalculating. "Go deliver your message," he said, then returned to the East Wing. "My Lord Brennan's assignment—" "I am the king," he said, quietly, without heat, the way a stone wall simply is. "Go." She went. The consequences arrived before evening. She had expected something. She had not expected Lord Brennan himself to appear in the East Wing corridor where she was working, his steward's chain catching the torchlight, his expression composed into the professional blankness that she now understood was his most dangerous face. "A word," he said. She set down her brush and followed him to the small alcove at the corridor's end, a space used for storing cleaning supplies, smelling of vinegar and tallow. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back and regarded her with the patience of someone who has decided that patience is the most effective weapon available. "You are a sensible woman," he said. "I have observed this." "My lord is kind," she said. "I am not kind. I am accurate." He tilted his head slightly. "The king is a good man. I have served him for 11 years, and I mean that without reservation. He is also a man who feels things deeply and acts on those feelings before fully considering their implications. It is the quality that makes him beloved by his people, and occasionally—" He paused, choosing. "Imprudent in smaller matters." Mabel said nothing. She waited. "His attention to you has been noticed," Brennan continued. "Not only by me. The southern lords who attended this week's council have eyes and they use them. The king's court already speaks. A king's sustained interest in an Omega servant, particularly one with no family connection, no political value, no protection of rank, creates a story. And stories once told widely enough become facts." He let that sit for a moment. "The story being told about you is not a kind one." The vinegar smell was sharp in the small space. Somewhere down the corridor, a torch sputtered in its bracket, and the light in the alcove wavered briefly before steadying. "What would my lord have me do?" she asked. Her voice was level. "Nothing dramatic, simply create distance. Avoid corridors where the king walks. If he addresses you, be respectful and brief. Give him nothing to return to." He paused. "I am not your enemy, Mabel. I am telling you what I would tell a daughter. The king's interest, however genuine, is a fire. Women in your position who stand too close to such fires do not survive the warmth. They survive the burning." He left. His footsteps were precise and fading, and then she was alone in the alcove with the vinegar and the wavering light, and the particular cold feeling of being warned by someone who might genuinely mean it as mercy. She thought about what he had said for a long time. She thought about how much of it was true. She thought about the wolf head clasp on the cloak folded inside her pallet, and the ice-blue eyes that looked at her as though she was worth looking at, and Sina's voice saying even a good king is still a king, and her mother's hands pressing 2 copper coins into her palm and telling her the castle always needed servants. And she thought, if I step back now, I step back into invisibility. And I have been invisible for 3 years, and it has kept me safe. And it has cost me something I do not have a name for yet. She pressed her back against the cold stone wall of the alcove and looked at the ceiling. Above her, somewhere in the upper reaches of the castle, the king was making decisions she was not privy to, by firelight, over maps weighted with iron. And in the East Wing corridor, her brush was waiting on the cold floor where she had set it down, patient as everything else she had left behind, while she tried to figure out whether the warmth was worth the burning. She did not have an answer yet. But for the first time in 3 years, the question itself felt like something that belonged to her. The truth about Brennan surfaced on a morning of cutting wind, when Sina found Mabel in the passage beside the grain store with the most serious eyes Mabel had ever seen on her. "He sent a letter?" Sina said without preamble, her voice low and taut as a rope about to snap. "To the Southern Lords. I did not see the contents, but the girl who sweeps his corridor saw the seal. Theirs, not the king's. Brennan wrote first. He invited them." Mabel went still. "What did he say about me?" "That the king was becoming distracted, unstable, that an Omega woman of no noble blood had gained improper influence over the crown." Sina pressed her lips together. "They are using you as evidence to question the king's judgment. If they gather enough support among the lords, they can demand a regency council." The corridor was cold and silent around them. Mabel felt the weight of those words settle onto her shoulders like accumulated snow. Slow, growing, capable of breaking branches. "It was never truly about me," Mabel said quietly. "I was simply the proof he needed." "Yes," said Sina. "And now he has lords riding to court." Mabel went to the king that afternoon. She had never sought him out before. It had always been the other way. She stood outside the council chamber door with her hands clasped before her and her knees wanting to give way. And then she knocked 3 times with her knuckles before her courage could abandon her. It was Cade who opened, the sparring partner, with his broken and reset face. He looked at her, glanced back into the room, and opened the door wider without a word. Leander was alone, standing before the window, watching the snow-covered courtyard below. He turned when she entered, and something in his expression shifted immediately. Not surprise, but a kind of relief that he did not try to conceal. "Mabel." "Your Majesty." She stepped inside. The chamber smelled of candle wax and old parchment, and the faint iron cold of the winter coming through the window's edges. "I have information you need to hear. I would not have come if I believed it could wait." He listened. He did not interrupt her once. He stood with his arms at his sides, and his pale eyes steady on her face while she told him everything. Sina's discovery, the letter, the seal, the Southern Lords, the word unstable used against him like a blade. When she finished, the chamber was very quiet. Then Leander turned to the door. "Cade." Cade appeared instantly. "My lord, bring Brennan to me, now, quietly." Brennan arrived composed, as he did everything. He stood before the king with his steward's chain and his pointed gray beard and his carefully neutral expression, and he did not look at Mabel, which told her everything about how thoroughly he had underestimated her. Leander placed the evidence before him. A second letter retrieved within the hour from Brennan's own locked chest by the king's authority, its contents confirming everything Sina had reported. Brennan looked at it. His composure did not shatter. It simply thinned, the way ice thins before it breaks. "I acted in the kingdom's interest," Brennan said. "You acted in your own," Leander replied. "And you used a woman who has done nothing but work honestly in this castle to do it." He paused. "You are relieved of your office. You will be escorted to your family's estate in the Eastern Hills before nightfall, and you will remain there. You will not correspond with the Southern Lords again. If you do, the full account of this matter will reach every noble house in Varenhold." He held the older man's gaze without blinking. "We are finished." Brennan left with Cade at his side, and the steward's chain removed from around his neck, and the door closed behind him, and the chamber was quiet again. Mabel stood near the window. Outside, snow was falling once more, soft and indifferent over the white courtyard. "The Southern Lords will still come," she said. "Let them come," Leander said. He crossed the room and stood before her, close enough that she could see the firelight moving in his pale eyes. "I intend to give them nothing to question." He reached out and took her bandaged hand, gently, the way he had done everything, as though gentleness were not weakness, but the most deliberate form of strength. "I intend to give them a queen." Mabel looked up at him. The words settled over her like the cloak he had left outside her door. Warm, and precisely her size, and more than she had ever thought to ask for. "That," she said softly, "will shock everyone." "Yes," he said. And this time, the shadow of a smile became the real thing entirely. Outside, Varenhold lay white and still beneath its winter sky, and for the first time in 3 years, Mabel did not feel invisible. She felt found.